She's a coordinator of the John Paul II Resource Center for Theology of the Body and Culture for the Diocese of Phoenix, Arizona, and the co-foundress of the Women of the Third Millennium, an organization that promotes the dignity and vocation of women and men through one-day retreats, articles, and talks. Katrina co-hosted a 13-part series on EWTN on Pope John Paul II's Theology of the Body. And she's the author of Discovering the Feminist. Hello. She's the author of Discovering the Feminine Genius, Every Woman's Journey, The Body Reveals God, and When Life Doesn't Go Your Way. That's a good one. As an international speaker, Katrina has spoken across the U.S. and in Switzerland, Austria, England, Canada, Guatemala, and Trinidad, and over 50 of her articles have appeared in the National Catholic Publications online. Born and raised in San Diego, California, Katrina earned her BA in theology from Franciscan University of Steubenville in Ohio, where she lived for 23 years until moving to Phoenix in September 2005. Katrina is also a swing dance instructor, an Argentine tango enthusiast, and the blessed mother of a young adult son, Michael. Please join us with Katrina Zeno. She's your next speaker.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a great joy to be here this afternoon. The question is always, am I going to speak or are we going to learn how to swing dance, right? Well, the problem particularly at a gathering like this is that the women rather outnumber the men. So we'd have a little bit of a problem. But I am delighted to be here this afternoon, and I'm a bit humbled to be speaking after all the wonderful presenters you've had so far. And it was especially illuminating to discover that according to Dr. Lester, I have a personality disorder because I am a morning person. So I'm actually very happy to have that personality disorder. I've been asked to speak this afternoon on the feminine genius, the beauty of God's design. And so I would like to ask you a favor, if I may, which is that would you mind if I change the talk title just slightly? Would that be all right with you? Because while indeed I will speak on the feminine genius, here's what I'd like to retitle this talk. Change the meaning of sex, and you change the meaning of the universe. Would that be okay if I retitled? I thought maybe that might interest you a little bit. And just a minute, I need to take this little box off of the PowerPoint so it doesn't annoy us the whole rest of the talk, since it's telling us that our internet is secure. All right. Good. Well, I'm grateful that you will allow me to change the talk title to you change the meaning of sex and you change the meaning of the universe. So I'd like to begin this afternoon with a story about a woman and a butterfly. One day, a woman found a cocoon of a butterfly, and she took it home. Every day, she observed the tightly closed, magnificently woven masterpiece, until one day, whoop, a small opening appeared. And being a Sunday, and since the office was closed, she sat down and watched the butterfly for several hours as it struggled to force its body through the little hole. Well, then the butterfly seemed to stop making progress. It appeared to have gotten stuck and to be able to go no further. So the woman, in her executive way, decided to help the butterfly. She took a pair of scissors and snip, snip. She created a larger opening in the cocoon, and then the butterfly emerged easily. But it had a swollen body and small, shriveled wings. The woman continued to watch the butterfly because she expected that at any moment the wings would expand to be able to support the body, which would contract in time. This never happened. In fact, the butterfly spent the rest of its life crawling around with a swollen body and small shriveled wings. It was never able to fly. What the woman, in her help and haste, did not understand was that the restricting cocoon and the struggle required for the butterfly to get through the tiny opening were God's way of forcing fluid from the body of the butterfly into the wings so that it would be ready for flight once it emerged from the cocoon. See, God had a design. I believe in our culture today, we as women have experienced something similar to this butterfly. We've been told repeatedly that God's design for a woman is restrictive. It's oppressive. It's smothering us. So you know what? Get out those scissors and do what? Snip, snip. Get rid of pregnancy. Get rid of fertility. Get rid of gender. Get rid of traditional marriage, and then we'll be free. And instead, we've ended up crippled. Emotionally, relationally, spiritually, and even sexually crippled. And confused. Confused about our bodies, confused about femininity, confused about sex, and even confused about the meaning and purpose of our lives and of the universe. So what I'd like to do today is to do a little bit of struggling, and I hope you're with me on that. After all, you've been refortified with some coffee and some delicious bars and cookies, so I trust that you won't go to sleep because you'll be on a caffeine and sugar high. So we can all struggle a little bit together by looking at the beauty of God's design for woman, sex, and the universe. To do that, I think a bit of an historical perspective would help in order to better understand how woman's self-concept and identity have developed in our culture. This is part of what we heard in Dr. Lester's talk, the importance of concept. And for us as women, especially the importance of how our self-concept has developed in Western culture, and particularly in the United States, over the years. And since I'm partial to Southern California, since that's where I was born and raised in San Diego, I'm delighted to be speaking in Southern California. This is what I like to call the 4 waves of feminism. The 4 waves of feminism, to give us a bit of a historical perspective. So the first wave of feminism began, who can tell me, in the mid-what? In the mid-1800s. Whoa, we have to go back a little bit further than we're accustomed to. Because in the mid-1800s, women could not own property. For the most part, they could not get a college education and they could not vote. It was people like Susan B. Anthony that struggled to obtain the right for women to vote, but also for the dignified treatment of black men and women. Then the second wave of feminism hit the shores of different countries. When do you think it might have been? In the 1920s and 30s, just depending on what country it was. So it hit various shores in the 1920s and 30s, and its momentum was geared toward educational and employment opportunities. Now, this might seem like old hat for us, for women to earn their PhDs and be CEOs of companies. But let's remember for a moment what it was like at the turn of the 20th century. My grandmother was born in 1899, and she lived to be 101. She died in the year 2000, so that meant her life spanned 3 centuries. 3 centuries. She was born in New England to a French-Canadian couple, and she lived in a small town that was dominated by a cloth mill. In fact, no woman in her town had ever been to college, ever. Well, a banker noticed my grandmother's quick mind and helped pay her way to prestigious Smith College. My grandmother was the first woman for her town to ever go to college. She even went to Madrid, Spain by herself on an ocean liner in 1919. Wow. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall because my grandmother was less than 5 feet tall. Going by herself in 1919 on an ocean liner across that huge Atlantic Ocean. I don't know, it took a month or so, by herself to study Spanish in Madrid for a year. Then in the 1920s, she married my grandfather, and even though she had her college degree and had been working as a Spanish teacher, she had to quit work when she got married. You see, at that point in time, it was not an option to be married and to work outside the home. Many of the things that we take for granted almost 100 years later are the direct result of the second wave of feminism. What about that third wave of feminism? This is the feminism that most of us are familiar with, because when I asked you when did this all start, most of you said 1960s. that this is actually the third wave of feminism. And it's what has often been called radical feminism. And it emerged out of the cultural upheaval of the 1960s and 70s. And while first and second wave feminism addressed some critical and unjust concerns, radical feminism seemed to get off track. Frequently, the main focus has been attacking marriage and motherhood and even gender, our masculinity and femininity, in order to gain equality, power, and reproductive rights. This has been the manifesto of third wave feminism. To try to overcome marriage, overcome motherhood, overcome our gender, right, so that we can be equal, so that we can gain power, so that we can gain reproductive rights. And in fact, one of the emphases of radical feminism has been to free ourselves from our biology, and therefore to free ourselves from identifying with our gendered bodies. Simply put, masculinity and femininity have no deeper meaning. They are simply convenient labels that we use to refer to the differences of our anatomical parts. That's all it means. Basically, male and female is parts. That's all male and female means. And so as a result, sex in its original meaning of gender, because that's what the word sex meant in the English language for centuries. It meant whether you were male or female. So sex in this viewpoint has only a biological function. Gender has only a biological function. That means it's an attribute only of the body, not of the person. This is key. My gender, being male or female, is simply one more trait that I have, like eye color or hair color, that can change without really affecting who I am. Because my gender is really only an attribute of the body, not of my person. This approach toward the body by third wave feminism has spawned two disastrous consequences, which many of your clients have been profoundly affected by. And that's why I wanted to give this historical perspective, because I think many of them have no idea that they've been raised in third wave feminism. And so two disastrous consequences of third wave feminism are, first of all, as we have gained mastery over the created order, which is a good thing, over the world around us through science and technology, then the result has been that mastery over the body has become one more arena where we have an unconditional right, and that's the key. An unconditional right to control, so that we are not determined by our biology. Essentially, if science can do it, well, then it's fair game. Thus, what we do, and you know this so well, is we cut up, we tie off, and we place carcinogenic hormones in our bodies so as to render neutral or to eliminate what distinguishes us as male and female. We even create babies in a laboratory so that having a mother or a father are unnecessary or even irrelevant. Can you hear what we've done? When we say that gender is only an attribute of the body, it has nothing to do with the person. And happily now we think that controlling our fertility, controlling is the word, controlling our fertility is just another blessing of modern technology, and we would be foolish to not use it. Can you hear the concept? That was so key, wasn't it? What Dr. Lester said? About how our concepts form our understanding of right and wrong, and how many women and men do you know are absolutely attached to this concept of modern science and technology being just another blessing of how we control our fertility unconditionally. So this idea of dominating the body and fertility without restriction, without regard for God's beautiful design, has led to a second disastrous consequence, and it's called gender neutrality. According to this viewpoint, gender is imposed on us by culture. It is merely a social construct. Why do girls want to be mommies and why do boys play with trucks? because that's the way we socialize them. This is what we tell them is right. You see, we impose on them these gender-constructed ideas. And so according to this vantage point, that gender is a social construct that we impose, a modern and progressive society, which we all want to be modern and progressive, is one that wipes out any type of gender distinction. And it accepts as normal whatever gender identity and sexual orientation an individual wishes to express. This is the modern and progressive society. And for us to insist on the binary concept of male and female, that is archaic. In fact, it's barbaric and racist. There's some pretty strong language that's been used against those of us who believe God has a design for gender, for male and female, and that we hold to masculinity and femininity. We've been called racist because we won't break out of these binary categories. Sexuality, the prevailing wisdom says, is a spectrum, and we should be free to move and express ourselves however we want on this spectrum. Like hair color. Tomorrow I'd like red hair. So I'm going to move on the spectrum to red hair. And then you know what, maybe in, a couple months I'll get tired of red hair and maybe I'll do something wild like pink. Huh? And then after that, I'll go back to being blonde. Does that change my person? Not really. You see, we think we should likewise be free to move anywhere we want on this gender spectrum. And it doesn't change who we are. Can you imagine for a moment? Father Hamp asked us beautifully to use our imaginations. As Catholics, we should be using our imaginations so much more. So can you imagine, just for a moment, being raised in this type of culture? Being raised in a culture where there is no cultural definition of masculinity and femininity, but only gender neutrality. Imagine growing up in that kind of environment. Do you think that perhaps it might cause a bit of confusion? Perhaps in some of our young people? And in their experience of the body and sexuality? And yet sometimes I think we don't make the connection. That this imposed almost gender neutrality is creating a confusion in our experience, our understanding, our concept of the body and of our sexuality and what it means to be male and female. I remember vividly when this concept of gender neutrality hit me like a slap in the face. I'd never really thought about it before. It was a number of years ago when I was visiting a friend in Washington, D.C., and I was bemoaning to my friend the struggles of being single. And I said to her, you know what? The hardest part about being single is being single in a married world. And she looked me dead in the eye, and she said, no, you're wrong, Katrina. It's not a married world anymore. It's a couple's world. Those 4 words changed my life. And perhaps they might change your concept today. It's not a married world anymore. What are the 4 words? It's a couple's world. It's almost as if you don't exist if you're not part of a couple. Look at the TV shows, pop music, the tabloids, Brad and Jen, Tom and Kate. Okay, no longer Tom and Kate. Right, but everyone's following it. Why? Because it's a couple's world. Practically everywhere we look, and now even as young as middle school, we are blitzed with the message that it's not normal to be single. It's not cool to be alone. Something must be wrong with you. And so people are hooking up, they're cohabitating, they're having friends with benefits, and they are experimenting with their sexuality. Because it doesn't matter anymore whether that couple is a guy and a girl, or a guy and a guy, or a girl and a girl, just so long as you are in some type of relationship That's the new God, the new idol, relationship with a small r, instead of relationship what? With a capital R, with God first. We all know how this couple mentality is playing out in California, don't we? How many of you here live in California? It's painful, isn't it? What's been happening with Proposition 8. And I was at a conference just recently, and I believe it was Janet Smith mentioned a legislation here in California that I wasn't aware of, or it might have been someone else at the conference, that there's now a law here in California prohibiting counseling anyone under 18 away from same-sex attraction. You may not do that. So you're painfully aware of those. So instead of focusing on those, I'd like to give a couple international examples to see how this couple mentality, this couple world, is global for the most, at least in the Western culture. In Spain, for instance, the birth certificates no longer say mother and father. For a number of years, they've said progenitor A and progenitor B. This is the new equality. Because the new equality means equality equals sameness. And so the only kind of distinction we want on the birth control, the only kind of distinction we want on the birth certificate is A and B. Progenitor A, progenitor B. Additionally now, also in Spain, one can walk into any of the government offices that issue the government IDs and demand on the spot that the gender on your ID card be changed without any explanation. So tomorrow I could change my hair color to pink if I lived in Spain, and I could walk into the government office and demand that my ID card be changed from female to male. No explanation. In Canada, there's a situation of baby storm. Do any of you remember when that was big in the news? So baby storm in Canada's parents are attempting to raise the child without any reference to gender. No reference to gender in the home. Baby storm siblings can't say whatever, boy, girl, he, she, which is why they gave the baby a gender-neutral name, Storm, so that the child won't be influenced by gender expectations imposed from the outside. And just this past weekend, July 8th, 2012, Google announced their new legalized love. LGBT rights are human rights. So I did not misspell this, legalized love, because it comes out of Great Britain. So this is their new push. Legalize love. LGBT rights are human rights. And on their website, I drew from it, I'll summarize, it said it's a campaign whose specific purpose is to decriminalize homosexuality and eliminate homophobia around the world so that LGBT communities can be safe and accepted wherever they are. This is their program for this year in a very focused way. Let me ask you a question. Does everything I've just described affect your clients? Deeply. Deeply so. Because it imposes on them a profound gender confusion, along with an identity angst that pressures them into experimenting with their sexuality so as to figure out who they are and where they fall on the sexual orientation continuum. Not only today, but next week, next month, next year. Can you see the pattern? Gender confusion leads to identity confusion, which leads to sexuality confusion. So I've got to figure out who I am as a man, a woman, someone who's gay, a lesbian, transgender, bisexual. And it might take me a while to figure that out, and a number of different experiments and experiences. So here's my question. In this kind of world, how do you create any kind of meaningful context for expressing and understanding one's sexuality? How do you create any kind of meaningful context for the concept labeled sexuality? You notice there's nothing in that bubble. Because you can't. My sexuality simply becomes one more plaything among many that I use recreationally. Am I describing some people you might know? One more plaything among many that I use recreationally because it has no deeper meaning. I use my tennis racket, I use my fork, I use my body. They're all on the same playing field. This is the background music, we could say. It's the couple's music, the gender neutrality music that is playing constantly in the minds and the identities of the women you minister to. They've been raised in the culture of third wave feminism, which has now been amplified by this aggressive message that is trying to legalize the acceptance of gender neutrality. And guess who gets to deal with it day in and day out? It's you. You get the fallout. You get the crises that are the result of this kind of conceptual thinking. Okay, that'd be really bad news if I said, thanks very much for coming. That's all I have to share. But instead we get to move on to the really, really good news, that it is such a blessing that we live at this time in history. This is not a depressive time to be living. This is a time when we should be rejoicing, and it is because of this person here, Blessed Pope John Paul II. Yay. And especially his theology of the body. So who here has heard of theology of the body? Who's never heard of theology of the body? Wonderful. And who's read theology of the body cover to cover? Okay, a couple people. Throughout his pontificate, and in an especially concentrated way in his theology of the body, John Paul II was laser focused on retrieving the true meaning of masculinity and femininity. Notice the real title of theology of the body is Man and Woman, He Created Them. Gender, meaning masculinity and femininity, is at the center of theology of the body. He was intent on retrieving the true meaning of masculinity and femininity. Intent on retrieving the truth that the gendered human body, not the generic human body, but the gendered human body is not only biological, but theological. When you go to bed tonight, this is what I hope will be running across you. Maybe you'll wake up in the middle of the night having those sci-fi dreams. Only instead of having sci-fi dreams, I hope you'll be having theology of the body dreams. And you'll be going, oh, the body is not only biological, it is theological. In other words, the body reveals God. Can you see my soul directly? You can't, can it? How can you see my soul? Through my body. So you see, it is my body that reveals God. And my body is not androgynous, it is not generic, it is feminine. Blessed be God forever. I am so grateful that I have a feminine body. And I'm so grateful that you men have a masculine body, because it is precisely in our masculinity and femininity, not apart from our masculinity and femininity, that our bodies reveal God. Can you tell I'm a bit passionate about this? And yet, for many, they heard us next door too, huh? And yet, for many people, the body is the last place they expect to encounter God. It's the last place they think they will encounter God, because the body is simply an object. That's all it is in our culture. It's simply an object among many that I use. Here's the slippery slope we have fallen down. Change the meaning of the body, and you change the meaning of gender. Change the meaning of gender, and you change the meaning of sex. You change the meaning of marital intimacy. And if you change the meaning of marital intimacy, then you change the meaning of our lives and the universe. That's a pretty intense concept, isn't it? You change the meaning of the body, you change the meaning of gender. You change the meaning of gender, you change the meaning of marital intimacy. And you change the meaning of marital intimacy, then you change the meaning of our lives and the universe. Do you see what is at stake in your work? This is what is at stake. Nothing less than the meaning of the universe. Because if you change